Hey everyone, welcome back to the workshop. Artisan Pirate here, and in today's fun video we're going to be talking about the epic Dark Tower series by the amazing author Stephen King. This is such an immersive world, and I just wrapped up finishing this series for the first time in a very long time. I began rereading the Dark Tower series in late fall of 2023, and I wrapped up with it the first week of August 2024, so it does take a little bit of time to read depending on how much of a speed reader you are. Again, I took a break from reading, but then, I got my speed back as I read more and more. I am from that generation that Harry Potter inspired me into reading. Everybody was talking about it, so I had to see what all the fuss was about, and I fell in love with that series, and I read it so many times over. My paperback books, they finally just fell apart. I was taping them together, and my family finally got me the nice hardback versions of those books that I still have, and I would like to revisit those because they really sparked my interest in reading. But after those finished up, I wanted to challenge myself with a more adult series, and then I found Stephen King, and I read his book called The Eyes of the Dragon, and that's kind of in the same vein of Harry Potter. Is kind of fairy tale based, but it also has a key figure that is in the Dark Tower series. And then when I was at a thrift store, I found the very first book in the series, and I read it, and I fell in love with the series. Not immediately. It took me a little bit to grasp everything. Again, I was around 13, 14, or 15 when I took my first journey to the Dark Tower. But the Dark Tower is based around Roland Deschain. He is the last remaining gunslinger in a world that has moved on, meaning he is in a version of our world. It's called the true world in some senses, and at the end of it is the elusive Dark Tower that stands in a field of roses. So throughout the course of the books, Roland is on a never-ending and repetitive quest to his final goal of the Dark Tower, to fix what has caused his world to fall apart. His world is very derelict. There is machinery that does not work. There's a few light bulbs that still work. Everything has kind of fell by the wayside. Cars don't work. Trucks don't work. There's a few oil machines that still do work. So he's kind of going through like this wasteland version of our world that's kind of just falling apart. And it's his hopes that once he gets to the Dark Tower, he can fix it in reverse time and bring everything back to life. Throughout the course, you meet a ton of colorful characters, and that are very well written in the style of Stephen King. And please keep in mind, because it is a Stephen King series, it does get weird at times, so take that for what it's worth. But this was my very first adult series I ever read, and I still love it to this day. And I love it even more now that I have revisited it and taken another journey to the elusive Dark Tower. It all begins with book one here. This book came out in 1982, before I was even born, and it picks up with Roland chasing the elusive man in black. He is trying to find him to get answers on how to get to the Dark Tower. So you pick up with him, following him across the desert, and the story begins with the famous line, "The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed." I'll flip to it real quick. Again, I'm not wanting to draw this video out entirely too long and bore you guys, but there you see it, that iconic line, and there you see the gunslinger there with the Zoltan on his shoulder. He will play a part in the book later on, but in this book it tells a story in reverse. He begins chasing the man in black, then it goes back to present time where he happened upon a dweller in like a little shanty shack, and then he tells a story of where he just came from, so going backwards in time again, and then you go backwards in time again to some of his childhood when he was becoming an apprentice gunslinger. But the book does end with him catching the man in black on the edge of the ocean, and they have a long, what is called palaver in this book, to where the man in black tells him how to ultimately get to the Dark Tower, and then the man in black vanishes, and Roland is left alone on the Western Sea, and that is where book two picks up. Now, when I read this at such a young age, I did not entirely get it, and I had to read it 2 or 3 times back to back before I'm finally starting to get, okay, now I get it, because I was very unfamiliar coming from the Harry Potter series of a story going back to back to back, just backwards in time. But in that book, you also meet Jake Chambers, and he unfortunately passes in that book as well, but he does come back into the story. Before he passes, he says the now iconic line that is on a lot of Dark Tower sites and merchandise: "Go then, there is other worlds in these," because there is a huge multiverse aspect in the Dark Tower series, and that will come to light in book 2, the drawing of the three. Now, in this book, part of the quartet is formed. It picks up the day after Roland talks with the man in black, and Upon the beach, he finds these magical doors, but before that happens, he is gravely injured. His right hand is deemed unusable. Creatures from the ocean come and damage his hand and damage his foot. He's trying to find medicine to recover properly. So in his gunslinging business, you know, not having both hands, that's going to be very detrimental. So now he is staggering along the beach and he comes upon 3 magical doors. And this is where the drawing comes from. He pulls Eddie Dean, who is an addict, and he goes through all the throes of recovery and, you know, withdrawal in the pages of this book. Eddie Dean is pulled from 1987. So with Eddie Dean, throughout the rest of the course of the series, you get a lot of 80s pop culture references, which I really love. He then pulls Odetta/Detta Walker from the second door, and she's pulled from the year of 1964. I've got my little cheat sheet here on top of the table saw in front of the camera, and she's from segregated America, so now you know what kind of references you're going to get from her throughout the course of the series. And she also has a split personality. And then the third and final door opens on Jack Mort, but in that book he does not draw Jack Mort. You'll have to just read the pages to find out what happens. But he does remedy a situation where Jake is allowed to live on, and now he's able to come back in this series in book 3. Again, this was a book that really played with my mind the first time it read it. But at the end of the book, Roland finds a way to unite Susanna/Odetta, there's a good and bad side to her, into one solid cohesive person. She is reborn as Susanna Dean, and she takes Eddie Dean to be her husband, and they are connected at the hip for the remainder of the series up until book 7. So that is book 2. And again, before I even got to book 3, I had to reread these two a few times to finally get the flow connected in my mind, again at a young age. But a great volume, and I appreciated it a lot more this go around into what it means to the whole story of the Dark Tower. Book 3 is where I was totally sold on the series. It is the Wasteland, and traditionally it has a train on the cover. The train is a pain, as you will find out in the closing moments of the book. The quartet is fully realized in this when they pull Jake back, and now the full quartet, which is Roland's core group, is formed. So Jake re-enters the story here in a very dramatic way. Again, I won't tell you how, you'll have to read it. But Eddie plays a part, and now that he is past his withdrawal symptoms, he is able to go into whittling again, something he liked doing as a child himself, and he's able to make a wooden key that helps bring Jake into Midworld and reunited once again with the man he really loves, and that is Roland Deschange, and he is now the symbolic son of the gunslinger going forward. You are also introduced to Oi, the Billy Bumbler. He is a cross between a raccoon and a dog, and he can loosely talk and repeat what you say to him. And if you say Jake, he'll say ache, you know, like ache. You know, so he can loosely repeat stuff. If you say hey, he'll say A, like E-Y, not H-E-Y. But he's a fun character and a very smart animal that's with them throughout the rest of the story. And you see the rose is on the front. Roses, again, are at the foot of the Dark Tower. It stands in a field of roses. But they also, through one of the magical doors, find a rose that is in a vacant lot. It is one solitary rose, and it is the center of all universes. Of course, it's in New York City. So in this book, you also meet Calvin Tower and Aaron Deepnew, who is actually very, very critical to the course of the series later on, because Calvin owns the tower, and ultimately the quartet of Roland, Eddie, Jake, Susanna, and Oi all try to get the vacant lot into their possession where they can protect the rose going forward. But it ends in the wastelands of the massive city of Lud, L-U-D, where there is kind of like a dramatic events are happening. You know, there's two factions that are fighting each other, and they have to navigate their way through it to get to the train to take them through the wastelands, because you cannot physically walk through it on your own. You have to take a train or something like that to protect you from the wastelands. That is why the book is called this. But at the end of the book, they get on Blaine the monorail and Blaine the pain. That is why I said that at the beginning. But there is so much more in this book. There's so many important aspects of the series released here in this book. This book came out in 1991. It was the first book that came out when I was born. Book 2 was released in 1987. Again, I got my cheat sheet here. I'm trying to go off the top of my head, as you can tell, but this book sold me on the series, and I was a fan of it no matter what happened afterwards. And that'll play a part when we get to the very end. Book 4 once again goes back in time and talks about Roland's past. This is the first time you get a full story from his past. You get a story of his very first love, Susan DeGaldo. They are in a old Western. I kind of get the vibe because there is some lingo here that leads me that this is kind of a Hispanic town that he goes to in his childhood. But it does pick up on the cliffhanger of where they were on Blame the Monorail. So they finished the riddle contest here. Again, I don't want to spoil a lot of stuff. They end the riddle contest here, and they come out in the world of Stephen King's The Stand. If you've ever read that early book by him, they are dumped off into that world and have to continue on. And through the journey of them going through the deserted world, again, going off the top of my head here, they sit down and Roland tells them a story from his childhood of one of his very first adventures as an actual gunslinger. And when I first read this book, I did not like it because I wanted to continue right off the Wasteland, you know, and continue. And you do in a way, but as I got older and I kept reading the series over, this became one of my favorite books in the series. As a matter of fact, Book 3 is my favorite in the series. This would be my number 2 favorite series. But it ends, and they ironically have to go to the glass emerald palace that the Wizard of Oz is in for them to wrap up and get back on the path of the beam to continue in Midworld to the Dark Tower. But a great volume, and it's many fans' favorite book in the series, and the more I read it, the more I love it. So many, again, iconic fixtures and characters are introduced here. Book 4.5, and the reason I'm saying that, this book was released after the initial series wrapped up in 2004. This is When Through the Keyhole. This came out in 2012, 8 years after the series wrapped up in 2004. So please keep that in mind. There was a demand for Stephen King to write more, and he said on a social media post that he could see through the keyhole again back into Midworld, and this was the result of that. And this is once again another story where you talk about Roland's past, and it's a story within a story within a story. So please keep that in mind. And there is enough information in the foreword of this book to where if you had never read the rest of the books, you could pick this book up and read it very quickly. You can see it's not a very long book, as is some of the other volumes, but I picked this up at the local Barnes & Nobles the day of release. This is a first edition. I had reserved it. I was eager to get back to the Dark Tower. In 2012 was the very last time I read the series, so a lot of time has passed from 2012 to 2024, and I was eager to get back to it once I rediscovered my love of reading. But the When Through the Keyhole chronologically is book 4.5. It follows right after The Wizard in Glass. It picks up with them, and they take shelter from a storm in a little hut. They bar the door, and then Roland sits them down and once again entertains them with a story from his early gunslinging days. A lot of people say read that book after you finish the series, like take 2 or 3 months away from the Dark Tower and then read When Through the Keyhole, because it's like revisiting old friends. But chronologically, it is between books 4 and 5, and that book was released in 2012. And after Wizard in Glass, Stephen King had his accident where he was involved in a hit and run, and they didn't know whether he would survive or not. And when he recovered, he made it his mission to wrap up the Dark Tower series, and the last few books was released in rapid succession. And a lot of people I have talked to on Stephen King fan sites, now that I have joined them and all, say that he wanted to wrap up the series quickly just in case anything like that ever happened again, and that he could know he would finish the series in his lifetime and not leave it to someone else. Some people say that the accident changed the trajectory of the Dark Tower series. I don't know. I don't know what the original outline for the series was, but I still think it finished up amazingly well. The first book that came out after his accident was Wolves of the Calla. This is also another fan favorite book, and if I had to rank the books, I don't like saying any one's better than the other one. Book 3 is my absolute favorite, but books 3, 4, and 5 would be my number 1, 2, and 3 if I had to rank them in the series. So much happens in this book, and again, I don't want to give it away, but it says Wolves of the Calla. The quartet is following, once again, the path of the beam, and they come upon this Calla Bryn Sturgis, where these villagers, and the way they're written, they're kind of more or less like Amish people, you know, and, you know, very low maintenance, very, you know, they don't have a lot of technology, stuff like that, but they do have access to other stuff in the outside world, and they very seldom get visitors. But once a generation, the wolves, as in the title, come and take the kids to dreaded Thunderclap, where they rob the kids of their personality, basically like a lobotomy, and I hate to even say that here on the channel. and then they return them to the townspeople where they are deemed ruined, R-O-O-N-T, which basically means ruined, and they have to care for them, you know. So the quartet arrives in town. They find out that the wolves are coming this generation, so they take a stand and fight to protect all of the kids. And this is one of the first instances where all of the quartet form in a cohesive gunslinger fight, and the fight ends on a cliffhanger because Susanna is pregnant in this story, and she's trying to hide it from the rest of the quartet, but it ends on a cliffhanger with her escaping to have the baby. Also in this book, you're reintroduced to Father Callahan, who was in Salem's Lot, another Stephen King book. Again, with all of these books, he is trying to tie in some way, shape, or form every book he has ever written, but it does end up on a cliffhanger, and Father Callahan does join the quartet for the remainder of the series. So please keep that in mind. That was book 5, released in 2003. In 2004, Song of Susanna was released. This book here mainly tells through Susanna's point of view, where she carries out the pregnancy. She has once again developed a split personality, and it's actually, and this is going to introduce some sci-fi and very weird elements, Susanna is not really pregnant. It's her split personality, Mia, who is actually pregnant and carrying the child. So she has to go through some psychological stuff to try to figure out how to get her to a safe place to deliver the baby. So please keep that in mind. But you also follow Jake and Father Callahan, who was split off from the rest of the quartet. They are trying to catch Susanna, and then Eddie and Roland, the gunslinger, track down, and they actually meet Stephen King himself, and they finally gain in this book possession of the vacant lot that was introduced in book 3. So now it is going to be fully protected going forward, and Susanna emerges in the year of 1999, and I guess Stephen King picked that because that was the year he was involved in the hit and run. Also, that event takes place in the books. This book here, from what I've gathered, and you can see it's not as long as the previous book or even the last book in the series, takes place chronologically in one 24-hour span of time. So one solid day is dedicated for the portion of this book, and this is a book I unfortunately do not like. Some people love it for the sci-fi and weird elements it introduced. A lot of people say it is just a continuation of Wolves in the Calla because it picks up the same day of the Battle of the Wolves here that ends the Wolves of the Calla book. But again, it's not one I would rank high if I was ranking all these. This one in book 2 would be towards the very bottom of it. I'd even, for me personally, in my personal preference and my reading style, I would put Wind Through the Keyhole above both of these books. But it's still a very essential book, and it sets up all of the events that is going to take us to the final installment, which is book 7, the Dark Tower series itself. And my books 4, 5, 6, and 7 are all first trade editions, and I'm happy to have that. I would love to get a first trade edition of all the books, but the first edition of the actual Gunslinger can go for thousands upon thousands of dollars on eBay, and that's U.S. currency. But everything comes to a close in the Dark Tower series. Many of Stephen King's iconic characters meet their ends in the pages of this book. You can see it's a long book, but it picks up with Susanna delivering the baby. The quartet is reunited, and then they have one final epic battle as a full cohesive quartet group in the Battle of New Haven, where they have to get rid of the beam breakers that are trying to damage the beams that support the Dark Tower, and it is its lifeline and everything. So then you have everything, and as you see on the cover, Roland is unfortunately the only member that reaches the Dark Tower at the very end and finds what he has been searching all of his long life for. And as I said at the beginning, keep in mind what that first line was in the very first book, because the very last line in the very final Dark Tower book is "The man in black fled across the desert and the gunslinger followed." So just take that for what it's worth. Roland is on a never ever ending quest for the Dark Tower, and book 6 and book 7 were both released in 2004. And then keep in mind, technically book 8, The Wind Through the Keyhole, was released 8 years later in 2012, but again chronologically falls between books 4 and 5. But this is the last book in the series. I really wish Stephen King would revisit the series, maybe with a different ending. I know when I got to the ending the very first time, I threw the book aside because I was mad. But then upon each rereading, I understood it was the only ending he had to go with, especially with all the references you get that Roland is on a never-ending quest for the Dark Tower. But if you have never picked up this series, I highly encourage you to pick it up and visit it. It is a massive, expansive world. It has multiverse elements, fantasy, sci-fi elements, and all in the vein of Stephen King. So it does get weird at times, which I really like, and you really have to approach these books with an open mind. But as I said, he tries to tie in some way, shape, or form all of his books. And as you see here, at the time of this book's release in 2004, you can see a list of everything he has written. Everything Dark Tower related is in bold print there, so you can see a vast majority of his work in some way, shape, or form is referenced to this epic series. And a lot of fans have a lot of fun reading all of his books and trying to find out and catalog which just word or phrase, chapter or character ties back into this epic book series. But I'm happy I took another journey to the tower. I think the next time I travel to the tower, it'll either be by once again reading the books again at night before I go to bed, or I might try the audio journey. I've heard a lot of people praise the audio books, especially people that like work out in workshops like I do. You know, they love hearing the story through someone else's interpretation, you know, doing the voices and all. So that might be an interesting way to go. But hopefully I've inspired you guys in today's video. Hopefully it wasn't too drawn out to check out the Dark Tower series by Stephen King. And I want you guys to recommend book series to me. Again, I'm trying to reread all of my Stephen King books because I'm also trying to hunt and find all of the references to the Dark Tower series. But once I get done with all those, hopefully it doesn't take me years and years to read them because he has written a lot of books. I can jump into some more epic book series. I did try the Wheel of Time series, but it was just a series I could not get into. I loved the first book. I didn't like how the second book started. Might be something I revisit in the future. Just let me know. If you enjoyed this video and it's your first time to this channel, hopefully you'll click that subscribe button and follow me across all my additional adventures and journeys. Keep in mind, I am a scroll saw woodworking artist, but I have just rediscovered my love of reading, and the Dark Tower series was a must reread for me. But I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. That's about all for this one. And again, if you're new, please subscribe and also follow me across all my social medias under the Artisan Pirate name. As always, links to contact me as well as all my social medias will always be linked down in the description box below these videos. That's about all for this one. And remember guys, if I can make it or do it, so can you. I'm the Artisan Pirate. Take care, and I'll see you guys real soon.